Hey, good evening. Welcome for coming out. We're going to do a quick little uh, 30 minutes on volunteer screening and, of course, talk about the conference. I brought Jessica out here with me today because she kind of went out and did a lot of the research on this. And being that at one time Jessica did run a little small children's ministry for a small church, she's kind of been involved in getting people to help her out, and she would come and talk to me at times and talk to me about people that she was really concerned about, that she was looking at maybe hiring, but just had a lot of questions about it. So what we want to do tonight is just go over some things that we think that you should really be doing. And these things will be emphasized at the conference this weekend. So Jessica, you ready?
I am ready. Yeah.
All right. So Jessica's going to be running the show tonight. I'll be doing the PowerPoint for her, but she's going to be kind of talking about the things that she's found on this, the importance of screening.
It's a nice little role reversal because normally I'm the one running the PowerPoint.
So here we go.
So one of the reasons that we wanted to come out and talk about this for a little bit tonight is I do the current events that we send out every Sunday. And I'm seeing a lot of increases in just church staff or church volunteers or people at the church being involved in incidents where sexual assault allegations and charges in some situations are being brought up. And when you go in and you look at that, it really is a mix of people at the church, but something that does pop up a lot is volunteers. And not only are we seeing an increase in that, but we're also seeing an increase. I've seen a couple different instances where there have been violent attacks by church volunteers, sometimes against other volunteers, and also a lot of thefts. And so the first one is an incident that happened just recently. And I put the link there and I'll send out the link in our follow-up email. But what it was is two church volunteers were volunteering and cleaning up the church, and a woman was sexually assaulted by another volunteer who was at the church while they were cleaning up the church at a church-sponsored event throughout the weekday. Another thing that I wanted to bring up was there was an incident in our church where a volunteer working with finances was stealing money from the church, and that was another instance of a volunteer. And then that third one is just kind of a catch-all because we have had, there was one case where there was an incident where a volunteer had a potentially violent mental disorder, and the church staff knew about it and they just kind of let it go and they were working with him. But while he was at an event with another church volunteer, he assaulted her. And then there was another one, it was a couple weeks back, and it was there was a child abuse case at a church committed by a volunteer. And when they did research into him, they found that he had done this at multiple other churches, and that every church that he went to, a allegation would come up and he would leave and go to a different church. And that's also why we wanted to talk about this, because a lot of the times when an offender commits a crime at one church or there's an allegation at a church, he'll go to a different church. And so that's why it's important to talk to references, which we're going to talk about in just a second. So the importance of screening, we kind of already talked about this, but the increasing number of sexual assault allegations, increases in thefts, and stories of attacks against other church members. And also I wanted to talk about here, a lot of the times we feel as though volunteers don't need as much they don't need as much scrutiny as maybe church staff or people that will be working more at the church. But it's important to remember that, especially if you have a volunteer in your children's ministry or dealing with your finances, it's really important that you do a thorough kind of review of them before you let them volunteer. And I feel like a lot of the times, especially from what I've seen, when it's a volunteer and not an official staff member, sometimes we don't do our due diligence in making sure that they're fully approved and have a clean background. And so it's really important, no matter the size of your church, that your volunteers get proper, you just make sure that they're clean, safe. And because a lot of the times when we see these things, like I said, it is a volunteer, and a volunteer is a representative of your church, even if they're not staff or not on the payroll. And so it's important that you do your due diligence there. So I was looking at some different tips, and I also talked to Jim. And one of the things that we kind of came up with 4 different tips for screening volunteers, and a lot of this might not be new to some of you guys, but it's just good to remember the importance of these just little tips in screening volunteers. And there are background checks and calling references, which kind of go side and side, and then shadow programs or test drives, and then also face-to-face interviews with the people that are potential volunteers. So background checks. Background checks provide useful information, especially when you're looking at volunteers for your children's ministry. Really, if you have anybody in your children's ministry, they should have a background check. Parents should not be allowed in classrooms. Anybody in a classroom should have some sort of background check, just for the safety of the kids. And also, at the second point says it's also good to protect your church against liability in case something does happen. It's always good to have a background check. So background checks are important. You can get them done for fairly cheap. But one thing to remember with background checks is that sometimes you only get a background check for that state, so it won't include charges in other states. And Dad, if you want to pitch in here, you can, because I know you know more about it. But they also do not include dropped charges or allegations, and that's why it's really important to call references, which we're going to talk about.
Well, this is just one of these things that we need to make sure that anybody that's in your children's ministry, and we're not talking about all volunteers being background checked. I mean, if you could afford it, that would be great. But if you have a large church and you have hundreds of volunteers, your greeters and your ushers might not be somebody that you would do a background check on. But we want to make sure when we get into volunteers for your children's ministry or in sensitive locations, like we were talking about the person that we just recently had in our church that was stealing money from us, that these are very important. And a lot of times, and we're going to get into this next, a lot of times these screenings or these background checks, a lot of churches don't charge people.
Mm-hmm.
So unless it's in a sexual assault, which you probably will, I mean, you have to by law contact somebody in reference to that. If not, you're really looking at a liability issue. But as far as the money goes, sometimes churches, when they catch people stealing money from them, just tell them, this isn't the church for you. Go, sin no more. We'll be praying for you. But the next thing you know, they show up in another church. So this is why we get into what Jessica is going to talk about next.
Yeah, and just kind of piggybacking off of that, but in one of the cases that I saw, there was a person who would sexually assault children at churches, and all of them were just allegations, but it was at 3 different churches that he was accused of this, but he was never charged. So in a background check, he would have come up completely clean. And that's why it's super important that we call references. And so like we were saying, it's really important because some things just don't show up on background checks, or sometimes the church doesn't want to press charges if something is done or committed. And so it's important to call other churches, not only just as good practice to make sure that their resume or background check or whatever is correct, but also sometimes when you call somebody about somebody, they'll say, you know, oh, they were great, but I just got this bad feeling. And so I think we talked about this in another online training, but it's important to really take into consideration when people, especially children's ministry staff, if they say like, oh, I just had a bad feeling or something like that, because a lot of the times when we see these sexual assault cases, somebody will always come up and say, I always had a bad feeling about that guy or something like that, which hindsight is 2020, but sometimes those tips and that advice can come in handy a lot, especially like Dad was saying, when you have churches that don't want to report if somebody was dealing in finances or if a theft occurred, calling those references can really prevent you from having an issue in the future.
One other thing that you want to do is when you're looking at references, if you see a big gap in between jobs, you kind of want to talk to them extensively about what they were doing during that time frame. Another question that you could ask when you call references, especially if you call the churches that they may have worked at, any place that they may have worked at, if you call those places, one of the things that you want to ask them, would you hire this person again? that's usually kind of a, a lot of times they don't want to talk bad about the person. They may hem and haw or things like that. But when you ask them a simple question like, would you rehire this person? If they hesitate on that or come right out and tell you no, then you probably have a problem. Like I said, a lot of times they don't want to talk bad about somebody, but that's just an easy question to ask that gets a good response most of the time. And like I said, be paying attention and listening, because if they hesitate, that usually means that there was an issue, a problem that you might want to make sure that you talk to uh, your new candidate. And let me say something. We're getting ready to hire a new youth minister, and so I was allowed to ask him questions, and I don't want it to anybody think that it was an interrogation, but I kind of asked him some questions that he was taken by surprise that we were asking these questions. And I think a lot of people were taken by surprise on the questions I asked. And one of the things that he had said right off the bat was that he had not come from a Christian church, and that later on he went to ministry school and all these different things like this. And I just kind of said, wait a minute, first off, when did you become a Christian? I wanted to know. And then I wanted to know about the conversion. When did this happen? And somebody joked in the interview process and said, yeah, Jim here used to be a policeman, and he might have arrested you once or twice before, and there was kind of a chuckle and everything like that. And he said, well, I never got arrested for some of the things we did. Well, whoa, put on the brakes here, And he said, I'm going to be honest with you. When I was a kid, 16, 17 years old, I did some bad things. I did some burglaries to a house. He was honest about it. But if we had not kind of drilled down and kind of went into the conversation and talked about it, and I was impressed that he was as honest as he was, which made me feel a whole lot better that I'm probably getting everything out of this guy that I really am looking for and more. So make sure that, when we do these callings of references, looking at the resumes, make sure that you're reading over these, especially if they're going to be in a sensitive location.
The other thing that I would add too that I didn't put on the screen, but when I worked as a children's director at the church that I worked at, a lot of the people that we were considering hiring were kind of younger teenage aged kids. And one of the tools that we used, and we kind of did this a little discreetly, but if their social medias were public, we would go on, or I personally would go on to their social medias and just kind of look at what they're posting. Because if you are looking for a volunteer for your children's ministry and you see that they're out underage drinking or partying or smoking weed, you don't necessarily want them in your children's ministry. And so that's just one of the tools that we used. And that is a free kind of source to figure out kind of what people are posting and what you see, because that can also really impact your decision, especially if other church members later on kind of follow them on social media and then see what they're posting, and there's that kind of shock, like, oh, you let this person work with our kids. We were able to avoid that because we checked early on social media. If it was public, we just kind of browsed it for a little bit. And so that's one of the tools that we used a lot. So don't underestimate the power of social media.
And Jess, I think that's an excellent idea. And you need to be looking at more than all their social media. Make sure that you look at everything that they may be on. In fact, you should ask them what is their social media so that you can take a look at it.
Yeah. So interviews, like Dad was just saying, if you are looking at somebody that you want to hire as a volunteer or even as a staff member, if you can get a face-to-face interview, that's best, because it just gives you an opportunity to kind of be with the person, read the person, like Dad was saying, ask them questions, and just get to know them, because it's hard to judge someone just based off of a piece of paper or a phone call. And so if it's possible, get them in for a face-to-face interview. And also if they're being hired or if they're signing on to be a volunteer in the children's ministry, try and get the children's ministry director, try and get, if they're working with elementary school or middle school or high school, try and get that specific person with them. Just so that way, as many people as possible, because sometimes somebody might have a question that's asked that you didn't think of. And so it's always best to have people in there, especially if you have your safety team. Like Dad was saying, it's nice to have them in there to kind of grill them a little bit. And then shadow programs. There's a lot of different names for these. Our church uses the term test drive. And basically what this is you have somebody with your new volunteer. You have somebody either on staff or somebody that's been there for years, somebody that you really, really trust, kind of shadow or kind of watch how your new volunteer, in this case, I think it would mostly be applicable to children's ministry, but you kind of watch how they engage with kids. Just watch how they do. And obviously people are going to act different when they know that somebody's watching them, but it still gives you a great feeler for how they'll act without the shadow person there. And it's good to do this for a couple weeks, I think maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks. But it's just good to not only let the volunteers get a feel for that area and make sure that it's something that they would actually be interested in, but just give the people in charge an opportunity to watch how they work. And I know when I did children's ministry at Generations, there was a test drive program, and also they normally paired teachers up together, because if you can with your children's ministry, you should always have two teachers in there. You should never have one teacher to one child, but you should always try and have two teachers in there, no matter the amount of kids. But obviously, sometimes you can't do that. So it is good to have that test drive or shadow program for as long as you can. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you did well on that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So do y'all have any questions?
Like I said at the beginning, a lot of this is not necessarily new information, but it is good to have a reminder to be screening volunteers, because that is something that kind of goes by the wayside sometimes. And so just remembering to and check in on your volunteers, because once you interview them, and if they pass everything, it's good to check in on them, every once in a while, make sure that everything is still going good, stuff like that.
Well, being that we're coming up on the conference, and Sandra Smith is going to be talking again with Protect My Ministry.
Mm-hmm.
I think another reason that we wanted to talk about this tonight is because we just see an increase in sexual attacks or sexual abuse on children in our churches.
Yes.
This is just something that is becoming a big concern. And I don't want to be reading about your church having an issue where since we've started the networking, we're starting to see a lot of issues come up that are going from church to church. And it wasn't more than 2 years ago, I got a call from a church, one of our, that sponsor us, and asked the question, hey, we have a youth leader here that has been sending and receiving some inappropriate text messages from a girl, and like the parents just found out about it. And they said, should we leave him on staff? And I said, do you have the text messages? And he said, well, we're getting them right now. And I said, I probably wouldn't let him stay at the church. You could send him home, leave with pay, but until the investigation's over, it probably doesn't look good if he's still sitting there at church, or this Wednesday night going to be working with the youth. So when these things arrive, you got to do something soon and real soon to kind of handle these things. So if you don't have any questions, if you don't have some questions out there, then let's just go through, because I don't want to, it's already 8:22, and here we go. So this weekend, October the 16th, from 7:50 to 4 p.m. is our 5th annual Church Safety and Liability Conference. And it's Tower Radiation really stepped up this year. They're going to be our big time sponsor and helped us out on this. We will have breakfast, we will have snacks, and we will have lunch. So please come, and we've got some incredible speakers. I just can't tell you how, and I hate to say it like this, but how excited I am, or humbled I am, or however we want to put it, that Frank Pomeroy is coming from First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs to talk. We're also going to have Alan Wilkett, Ricky, who talks about human trafficking, Ricky Rooks, who's with USCCA. Dr. Mark Jones, he's going to be talking about inner city stuff that we should be paying attention to, because we need to make sure that we help anybody and everybody that comes into contact with our church. Sandra Smith will be talking about Protect My Ministry. Joanne Bear is our lead medical team leader at Generations Christian Church, and she's going to be talking about medical. Cameron Allen is going to be talking about mental health. We have been talking about mental health here lately. In fact, we're doing a class on mental health now, because we're going to see more of it coming into the church, and we need to be prepared as safety team members and the church. Paul Atherton is going to talk about general liability. Angela Saraba is going to be talking about civil and criminal liability that you could run into. And then, of course, we're going to have Holly Wade, who's going to be talking about the Tampa Bay Regional Intelligence Center. And we're hoping to get that up here and running real soon. This is Frank and I at a fundraiser that we were doing for one of the survivors of Sutherland Springs. Like I said, I'm really excited about having him come and speak. One of our sponsors this year, of course, is USCCA, and it's going to be good to hear Ricky talk. And if you carry a concealed weapon, you should make sure that you have some sort of protection. You don't drive your vehicle without insurance. You should have some sort of protection if you're going to be carrying concealed weapon. We have free resources out there. We have putting together a safety plan, developing a safety team, carrying weapons in church, and Sunday morning what to look for. All we ask from you is your email address, and we will send you those downloads. We have our online membership program. Sign up today to access our online church safety training libraries. This will be on our library. So in the future, you could go out and look at this. You could also show your team members. And this, of course, supports our ministry. And plus, you get a free ticket to our conference. And of course, then we have the church safety and security membership program, churches. And really, if you're on here tonight, you need to go back and talk to your church, because we're starting to see more and more bigger churches starting to join with us. And this just gives us more information, more training, different things that we can talk about, those what if scenarios. What would you do if this? The 125 or 1,200 a year gives you a 2-hour training, scheduled phone call, consulting calls with me, 5 tickets to the annual church safety and liability conference, discounted full strength and weakness assessment, and also your safety team has full access. If your church cannot afford a membership, consider a local business owner to sponsor your church. We have multiple ones of that. These are different trainings now that we're doing, but we're doing situational awareness, threat profiling, verbal de-escalation, what if, mental illness in the church, and of course our laser shot training. The members only Zoom call will be Thursday, October the 21st. This is something where we sit and go face to face with the members with the membership, so that we can talk about things that are going on in their churches. And it's just an opportunity for us to meet and have a good conversation on church safety. We have a YouTube channel called True Christian Talk. We're out there on Thursdays. We're out there live at Thursdays at 11 o'clock. We look at the world through a Christian lens. We kind of take off our Trinity Security Allies hat and we put on a different point of view, and we say kind of what we really want to say sometimes, but we have to be careful because of our 501c3 status, which, if you did not know, the current administration is trying to go after Christians that have Christian organizations that have 501c3 status. So you should go out and listen to what we're talking about. We'll have the book at the conference for $20. You'll get your own copy. And since I'm there, I'll be more than happy to sign it for you. Thank you for coming out tonight. Are there any questions?
I'm not seeing anything.
I really hope that we get to see y'all out there this weekend. We're really looking forward to it. Well, if there's nothing else, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. I hope to see you this weekend. Please be safe out there and be blessed. And we'll talk to you real soon. Have a good night.